I'm really pleased to be with you here this morning, Derek. Thanks so much for having me. As the CEO of RDA Consulting, I've been with RDA for 14 years. I started here in the senior consulting staff, and I worked with the firm to develop our structure for service delivery and business development as we grew. And I ultimately became our CEO during the transition to an employee ownership trust. RDA is a majority woman managed California social purpose corporation. We're headquartered in Oakland. We currently have about 25 employees and I do about $6 million in business annually. I think it is worth noting, Derek noted that we are very much a mission-driven organization. And as such, we have a triple bottom line and always have our profitability, our social purpose, and our commitment to our employee owners. When we became a corporation at the transition, we had the opportunity to become a social purpose corporation. And that's just a great fit for us in terms of corporate structure all around, given that we're a mission-driven organization.
Awesome. Appreciate that. So yeah, let's warm up and maybe we can almost like go through the story step by step. I'd love if you could start by just talking about like how you got involved in RDA, your journey to being like, more and more senior in the org, and like maybe you could talk a little bit about what made you want to stay so long and then eventually, come on as an employee owner and CEO.
I never expected to be someplace for 14 years. I think that that's actually fairly atypical for careers these days. I actually knew Robert and Patricia Bennett, who founded RDA, through my work as a legislative assistant. We had worked on many advocacy efforts together through the years, and there came a time where it just made sense. I was looking and they were looking for someone. I went on to do management consulting, and there was a time where it just made sense for us to join up. And I think the way it's been possible for me to be at RDA for this long is that my role has changed multiple times, and it's kept it really interesting. I can't say that I don't miss the active consulting element, and I try to do client work to really keep that live for me. But it's been a great. It's felt like a very fulfilling career to move into an executive role and ultimately into the CEO role. And so I think that's the first part of your question.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I'd love to hear a little bit more about that transition. I think for a lot of folks who are thinking about employee ownership, there's somebody like one or a few people in the company
Right.
who, in some ways, like their idea about transitioning to employee ownership, while it obviously rests on the whole employee base, doing well and, being able to run the company, there's often like a couple people for whom the transaction actually like relies on them as like leaders, and clearly you were one of those people in this case. And
right, and there were a couple of us, and I think you're right, I think that's critical for the exiting owner. Obviously a lot of becoming an EOT is about protecting legacy.
yeah,
And so, also having a management team in place that's going to protect that legacy is pretty critical. I think the fact that I had been there for 14 years and had been through most areas of the business. My colleague, John Trevetto, is our COO, and he also came up through consulting, but he moved into the operations role a year before the transition. So I shadowed Patricia, our owner, and he moved into an operations role, which really allowed us to get our arms around the business. I think it's critical as a services organization, it's critical that we understood the dynamics and structures of the delivery organization.
yeah,
But just as important is understanding the operations of a small business. And so, I think Patricia really leveraged that opportunity. I don't know how unique this is. I think Patricia probably, and she'll tell you this, that she probably would have liked to have done this several years earlier. And the pandemic kind of
the
got in the way.
succession or the transaction or both?
Succession and transaction.
Got
She
it.
started exploring the various options, I think, which we'll talk about in a little bit. She started exploring those before the pandemic, and I don't think the pandemic was a great time for a transition of this type. And quite frankly, as a services organization with a lot of early stage employees headquartered in a very expensive metro area, we saw a lot of turnover during and after the pandemic. And so I'm not sure that we had the same sort of core of tenured staff that somebody would find ideal. But I do think that the fact that both John and I had the experience of being there, he had been there, I think he'd been there 8 years when the transition occurred. So,
Yeah.
we've worked together 10 years at this point, and
Yeah.
I think that helped a lot.
Well, I think that in the context of that sort of pandemic turnover, that only highlights, the importance of leadership and kind of key players, so to speak, even more. I'd love to just hear a little bit about, so just in terms of order of operations. So Patricia started looking at options for transitioning to employee ownership, and it sounds like around the same time you started shadowing her. John had already moved into the COO role, and you started shadowing her as, the potential candidate for CE. Just walk me through like the order of operations,
Yeah,
just
I'll
so I
walk
can.
you through the order of operations and also the timeline.
Yeah,
So I think Patricia looked at the ESOP option first, and that was pre-pandemic. And she was doing quite a lot of work on that. And then, we are in the Berkeley, Oakland area, and the co-op model was also obviously something that she looked at as well. Post-pandemic, we became an EOT at the end of 2022. So post-pandemic, probably 2020, late 2020, we started really getting serious about what option it was going to be. And Patricia actually took it to the employees to determine between a co-op and an EOT. We decided that at our size, and with the dynamics of services business and the sort of early career nature of a lot of our employees, an ESOP just was not an ideal option for us. And so I think the employees were really excited about an employee ownership trust. Patricia was as well. And at that point, she put together the transition team. And so that would have been, late 2020, or that would have been 2021. And then we probably spent about 18 months managing the transition. 6 months after that, we started stepping into roles where John took over the operations role and I started shadowing Patricia in a stronger fashion.
got it.
At
Okay, so
that
you
point, we
had
brought someone on to take my role,
got it.
who could run the consulting organization.
Okay, got it. So you had been in kind of the beginning of the transition structurally, like figuring out the transition. And then during that process, that was where you and John kind of stepped into the more managerial roles. Got it.
Right. Well,
Got it.
we had been members of the executive team, which where we
Yeah.
stepped into the roles we have now, which
Yeah.
is, I think, the core executives of the organization.
Got it. And I want to go back to the kind of decision-making process around which structure in a minute, but
Mhm.
just to hone in on that sort of period of like management and operational transition. What was that like for you guys in terms of shadowing Patricia, taking stuff, getting ready to kind of step into the role of like leaders in an employee-owned organization? Yeah, what happened there?
I think a lot of small businesses that are really an LLP before exploring employee ownership, there is a lot of organic development of processes and
Yeah.
responsibility. And we had a great transition plan. Patricia and I did a lot of research on what knowledge we needed to transfer.
Yeah.
Um, I think
So you
even
guys had like a
still,
list or something of
oh
like,
yeah,
here's
we
all
had
the
a work plan.
things that needs to
Oh yeah.
be
And we
transitioned.
even knew when we were going to start on what,
Nice.
introducing me to the bankers, the whole thing, right?
Yeah.
I think the thing that I think we found that I would urge any owner to really consider is owners owners tend to do a much more wide-ranging role than a traditional executive. And it's grown organically. It can be
Yeah.
hard to move it can be hard to move some of those responsibilities off an owner's plate. I think there's a singular level of dedication and commitment that just cannot be denied. And so
Right.
I think one of the things we found is that we have this really great transition plan, and yet there are so many processes that never became fully defined because they were just, it's almost like, how do you tell someone how to breathe?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And so I think that that's one of the things that I think an owner who's really thinking about this process can ask themselves. I think another thing that might be unusual is because of the interruption in the process, we um, Patricia is on our board as a ex officio member. She chairs our trust stewardship committee, but she is not with RDA in any official capacity. I still do calls with her on a quarterly basis because
Hmm.
I value her input and wisdom and
Advisory kind
experience.
of. Yeah.
But I know most owners that I've talked about through Steward Circle and other EOT events, there's a transition period. There's a longer transition period after the roles are changed.
Yeah.
And I think that that can be helpful. I became
Yeah.
CEO at the transition, technically.
Right.
Patricia went on a long and well-deserved vacation.
Nice.
In a lot of ways, that forced us to figure things out. But I do think that there were some, I just think that there's a funny way that processes grow organically. And, we
Hmm.
do a lot of org development in our firm, and Patricia and I both specialize in that area. So we've had conversations about this. Again, it's like, how do you tell someone how to breathe? This is just what I do.
Yeah.
So I don't know that you can plan for all of that, but I do think querying ourselves on what are the things that might feel really obvious that have grown organically is one thing. And two, be prepared for some of that. If you're a
Right.
small business, you probably don't have, as part of preparing, and as part of actually just sort of scaling our organization, we have outsourced HR through ADP, which has been invaluable for an organization of our size. We have an outsourced fractional CFO who's
Hmm.
very familiar with our financial system, which is a financial system that is built for working with government.
Yeah.
Um, and we have outsourced IT. So a lot of those
Yeah.
structural things were already taken care of. And I think that also really helped the transition. I don't think you need to do all three, but I think there's great questions to ask yourselves as an organization about sort of, what are the pillars of strength? Where is the new executive team going to rely for sort of standard operating procedures? Um, and what are the things you just need to be intentional about discovering along the way? And our
Yeah.
first year was absolutely great. It was just,
Hmm.
there was still an absolute, drinking from the fire hose feeling at times.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I'm constantly surprised by, we obviously talk to lots of owners who are thinking about the transition, and I'm constantly surprised by how many of these outsourceable functions an owner will say, like, point to and be like, well, the current leadership team, they do like, sales and like, shop operations really well, but like they can't do accounting, so we can't transition. And I'm often like, well, maybe part of the transition is like finding like a fractional CFO or like
Right.
augmenting the current leadership team. And it sounds like you guys had a really intentional process of saying like, okay, what are our strengths? Now, how do we augment that team so that, as the owner transitions out, these things aren't just being, it's not like somebody has to learn on the fly, but there's also like resourcing for these, functions that maybe the owner was just doing ad hoc.
And also keeping us sort of abreast of new developments in the market, which I think, especially in these first few years, has been really helpful. During the pandemic, many of our team moved to cheaper markets, right? So
Right,
now we are all over the country. Having outsourced HR has really helped us keep abreast of what the requirements are in those various states.
right.
Um, I wouldn't say I think we have good spread, but we're, just in a few states. But
Yeah,
still, we need to know that. And I think also really anticipating financial implications of various developments our fractional CFO has been absolutely critical for that.
yeah, yeah. That's really interesting. Okay, so just a little bit more on that, and then we'll go back to the sort of options and how you guys came to what you did. What was the communication with employees like during, like, from the earliest part of the process all the way through to kind of the launch?
That's a great question. I think Patricia was extremely transparent about a year prior to the transition. That's what really we launched a communication plan at that point.
Yeah,
We named various employees to the transition team. She let people know what her intention was. We talked about what the transition of responsibility was going to look like. Um, we did regular updates, although one thing I learned is you actually can't update people often enough.
Hmm.
If you're thinking quarterly, consider monthly.
Hmm.
Just because I think it's hard to anticipate the level of anxiety that folks might feel in the absence of recent information.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so at the end, we were definitely doing monthly updates. And even though there might not be, even if we were reiterating what we said last month, that seemed to help a lot because for employees, the first thing we did was change our corporate structure. What does that mean? What does it mean to be a social purpose corporation? In our world, there were a lot of, well, why isn't it a B Corp, right? So
Right. Right.
you understand the level of interest or knowledge that your employees have and be prepared to speak to that.
Right. Right. Yeah. I'm thinking of the transition that we did with Clegg Auto. And I know that during that process, there was a lot of like, that's the employee base is a little bit more like blue collar group of mechanics. And I know that during that process, there was a lot of support, but also kind of, is this real? Like, is this actually happening? And so to your point, like the more communication we could do, the better, because people were kind of like waiting for it to become real
Right.
almost. Yeah.
Right. And in the absence of information, this is a rule of organizational development and probably
Mm,
human psychology. In the
sure.
absence of information, people will reach their own conclusions.
Right.
And so, and sometimes those are driven by personal experience and anecdotes. So
Right.
I think it's just a lot easier to manage folks' feelings of confidence, and balanced with anxiety if you just have a regular message and a regular
Yeah.
update and a venue in which to share that and a way to
Yeah.
take questions. Frankly, we had an anonymous question line that we had anyway.
Hmm.
We use a really cheap tiny little piece of software called Incognito,
Hmm.
that allowed people to post questions that they had without feeling like they were making themselves vulnerable for not knowing enough about the business. And
Right.
they're employee owners now, but that doesn't mean they're going to know about every aspect of the business. So I think, creating that
Right.
space for them probably was helpful.
Yeah. So interesting. Okay, so kind of taking a couple steps back and going back to the kind of decision making points in the process, like was there a point at which you or Patricia or the transition team kind of realized like, oh, this is going to work, um, this is happening, and what led up to that moment, and what was the kind of key information that got you there, if there was such a point?
I feel like that's such a great question. I think we all were, I think there were 2 points. One, when the valuation came back and there was general agreement on it,
Yeah,
and two, when the financing got put together, which is really late in the process. So I
yeah,
think we
yeah.
all carried a lot of uncertainty throughout the process that we were just willing to manage as part of the transition team. But I think that that's, it's not real till it's real.
Right.
And so I think that's another thing to just be prepared for, is that there's going to be a feeling of like, is this really going to work? But getting the valuation and having general agreement on that, I think was probably the moment when we all knew it was going to work. And then it
Yeah,
was a matter, and we worked with someone to help us put the financing together. So
yeah.
that was the next piece.
Got it. And was there a negotiation, a back and forth with the previous owners and kind of the leadership team about those numbers and what that looked like? Or did it come back and you guys were all kind of in agreement quickly? What did that look like?
That is also a great question. I think there was a lot of agreement, but if I am 100% honest, none of us factored in our current debt position quite enough.
Hmm.
So I think, we generally agreed on the value of the business. I don't think that we looked at, collectively with our consulting team. I don't know that we looked at the current debt. We had an emergency loan from the COVID, for the pandemic,
Yeah.
um, to the SBA, very, very low interest. Had never really thought about it because it's so low interest. It's almost like free money
Right.
unless you need to go out and get a line of credit.
Right.
And so when you put that together with the loan and the note um, to the owner, um, we really didn't look at the need for a line of credit as much as we needed to. We're a small business. We work primarily with government and the social sector, CBOs, community-based organizations, nonprofits. Um, and our business is cyclical. It really is. And so the line of credit is something that has always sort of gotten us through across the year. I mean, we take it out for a little bit, we pay it back. We take it out,
Yeah.
it's, and I don't think the importance of that mechanism was appropriately considered in
Yeah.
the,
Got
and I
it.
don't think any of us knew, because the line of credit came together with the financing for the deal. I don't think any of us considered it as a discrete item. And
Got it.
that's something I would encourage any small business to do, both the owner and
Yeah.
the the employee purchasers,
Yeah.
uh, buyers, to, really think about, like, what are the various financial mechanisms, and does this deal support that?
Add up. Yeah. Yeah. We didn't get a chance to work with RDA on the transition, but
Right.
what you're describing is a lot of why we've kind of moved a lot of that stuff to the very front of our process, which is like very heavy on the financing and sort of feasibility financing side, partially because there's this puzzle of like, here's all the different pieces that have to be put in place. And when you add them up, does it work for the business? So that makes a lot of sense as like
Yeah.
kind of a focus. Um, awesome. Yeah. I mean, maybe on that note, do you want to just talk to us a little bit about kind of I don't know, the nitty gritty of the like financing and how the transition and transaction worked for you guys?
Um, sure. So, um, we had, obviously an external evaluation done, and we had a team of folks who brought together, um, a variety of resources, in terms of transition planning, in terms of attorneys, and also those who provided financing. Um, and so it was a fairly smooth process because it all sort of came as a package. I do think that that's sort of one of the things that stopped us from really considering the importance of that line of credit.
Mhm.
Um, so, that's again why I say,
Yeah.
pause and consider each element very independently to make
Yeah.
sure, we are basically self-funding our line of credit right now, which, for a small business is not optimal.
Yeah.
Um, that's a lot to put in reserve on a long-term basis, but we're
Yeah.
doing it. I would love to save any other small business from doing the same. And I want to say, Derek, I know other organizations who are in the same position. I
Mm.
think in the early days, and I know we didn't work with Common Trust, but in the early days, I think maybe there wasn't sort of that, it's the buyer, it's the seller, and it's the business and the sustainability of the business,
Mm.
and it's weird to say that at 2 years of tenure, we're one of the older EOTs out there. Um, but I do think that that's something that for those that transitioned at around the same time as us, and not just EOTs,
Yeah.
um, because in my network, there's also a number of co-ops,
Yeah.
that's something that sort of, I think we'll look back on and say, well, that was not our best moment, but we all got through it, and nobody does it that way anymore.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, like very carefully considering the whole financing stack and making sure that it works for organizational sustainability as well as the transaction itself.
Right.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Um, cool. I guess just on, so you kind of answered my next question maybe already, but maybe aside from the financing point, what were some of the biggest like challenges or things that came up during the process, and how did you navigate those in terms of the transition and making it happen?
Um, I think I the transitions, it's 2 years ago now. The transition itself, because we had that plan, felt fairly smooth. And another thing our consulting team did is they had us put together a decision matrix. And that was probably one of the best things we did. It reads like a RACI chart, but not quite,
Hmm.
because sort of the decision points for an employee ownership organization is a little bit different.
Sure.
Um, in that, we have a, a TSC and a board.
Yeah.
But that was probably one of the best uses of our time, because it forced us to go into our trust agreement, our bylaws, and really look at corporate best practices, So from that perspective, that was something about the transition that I think really worked well. We just find where decisions would live.
Yeah.
We shared those out to the people who were involved, and ultimately we shared that out to the whole company.
Yeah.
So that there was some transparency about, what is the role of the board versus the TSC. And we adapted, I don't know how many people are familiar with the RACI model, but it's basically, it clarifies roles. It's responsible, accountable, consulted, and informed. And we basically adapted it to RACIV with veto at the end, because in our minds, the trust stewardship committee really kind of functions as a veto for anything that puts the trust in jeopardy.
Right. Right.
And, so having that documentation out there really forced us to think through,
Yeah.
how we would operate. And I think that was a tremendously good use of time in the transition.
Yeah. Yeah. Super interesting. Right. So like more on that's just in a way it's just like underlining the importance of like role clarity and doing all that as a part of the transition itself.
Right.
Um, what so we're kind of talking about structure here now, but maybe as we back our way into that, like what was the decision moment where you decided on the EOT versus it sounds like maybe co-op or ESOP were the other two options that you were looking at, and why did you guys decide to
Yeah.
go the employee ownership trust route?
So Patricia rejected the ESOP model as overly complex and frankly expensive long term.
Yeah,
We, consulting firms generally, like a lot of services firms, have a layer of early career folks who are not particularly compelled by the benefits of an ESOP. It's not that they
sure.
shouldn't be, it's that they simply, that's not, that didn't seem to balance the complexity of managing it. And that is certainly
Right.
not true for every business. It was true for our business.
Yep.
And so because we're in the Bay Area, she looked strongly at co-op or EOT. And again, we presented the options to employees and gave them an opportunity to weigh in. And ultimately she decided on the employee ownership trust because, I think, as we all know, it's incredibly flexible in terms of setting up your governance and in terms of setting up what are the expectations of buying in or not buying in terms of how profit sharing is determined. All of those offer a high degree of flexibility that can be customized to your workforce, your new owners.
Yeah.
And so I think that was far and away the most uh compelling reason to go with an EOT.
Got it.
Um, and I think, we had not previously had a board per se. There was a meeting of 3 people twice a year.
Yeah.
Excuse me. But so I think developing a board was something that was very new for us. And I think we had an opportunity to really examine the benefits and challenges of our governance structure. If you think about the transition as, a 2-year period that is still in process, that I think has been one of the harder challenges. And take a sip of water real quick.
Yeah. Yeah. I mentioned earlier, but both Amalia and I are getting over colds, so you guys will have
Oh,
to
yeah.
forgive us for being a bit nasally. Um, that makes a lot of sense. Yeah. So you guys decided on the EOT, and you mentioned kind of flexibility and customizability as kind of the main selling points there. How does that reflect practically for RDA now, like post transaction? Like how did you end up using that flexibility?
I mean, I think we use that flexibility in terms of our management structure and in terms of our how we do profit sharing.
Okay.
You, Derek, I mean, we kind of don't know what we don't know, right? I mean, I
Sure.
don't know what it would be like if we'd chosen one of the other routes. I will say that the simplicity of the EOT has not been a barrier in this transition.
Yeah. Nice. And so you guys have a fairly traditional management structure, if I understand correctly, like executive team, rest of the team type of thing.
Right.
What maybe you can say more about the profit sharing and how that was conceived and what that looks like for RDA and anything that you've learned along the way. I know that a lot of people kind of get into it, do, some profit sharing and then shift around their model depending on, what's working and what's not
Mhm.
working? Be curious.
So I personally, I love our model. I think, we, we really, thought John, our COO, and I really like put our heads together, and we've been working together for a long time, and we were very much aligned that while we wanted to continue to have bonuses that are based on performance and salary, we wanted profit sharing to be on a gross revenue basis, so very equitable for all employees.
Yeah.
We set a low bar for profit sharing. We distribute 25% of profits. Every employee
How
who
do
isn't
people become, oh, I think you're about to answer
Yeah,
this.
yeah.
Yeah.
Every employee who isn't on a PIP starts with one share. We have a multiplier that we apply for tenure up to a certain number of years that's reasonable for our industry. So, I don't continue to get the most for tenure just because I've been here a long time. I topped out. I topped out before we even became an
Got it. So there's like you kind of earn your way through tenure into a larger and larger share of profit sharing, and then there's like a cap at
and then
some
there's a
point.
cap, and that's the most you're going to get out of profit sharing. We
Got it.
also, because frankly, we're a services business and, whatever we bill, that's what we bring in. We thought it was really important to reward people who have been here for less than a year. They are
Yeah.
part of our plan. And so we also have a prorated share based on the number of months that people have been there. So everybody in good standing gets a share of profit.
Wow. Interesting. Even
Yeah.
if they're relatively new.
I mean, 1/12 of something is, at least
Something.
it's an
Yeah.
acknowledgement that they've been here, right?
Yeah, totally. Super interesting. Cool. And maybe just, how is that working out? Like, how do employees feel about it? How has the communication been, working on that?
So I'll be very honest with you. Year one was a dream for us. We hit all our numbers, we hit all our targets, we got the board stood up, and that felt really, we were able to do profit sharing. Year two has been more challenging just because of changes in our market.
Yeah.
There's a deficit in the California budget. We there's just a whole lot of unknowns coming up this year in terms of what's going to happen to public sector organizations and those who contract with them, including our clients who are service providers.
Yeah.
And so we didn't do profit sharing this year, but I think following the model that we started in the transition plan, I think we communicated pretty regularly with people about where we were. And at the end of the year, I did not hear, and I think this is actually unusual for a fairly vocal group of folks. I didn't hear anyone say it's really unfair we didn't do profit sharing. I think people were
Hmm.
like, okay, we
Yeah, I think a lot of people worry about this. Like,
yeah.
what happens when the business, goes through a hard year or whatever? As an owner, maybe I just like took that on the nose, but isn't everybody just going to feel, super terrible and leave if we don't hit a profit sharing,
Again, I think we were really explicit about the challenges that we were facing.
Yeah,
I don't think that people were thrilled. I just think
sure.
they understood. And I think a part of that was keeping those lines of communication open.
Yeah, totally. Um, I'll just do a quick reminder if folks who are watching want to drop questions in the Q&A box or in the chat or whatever, this is a good opportunity to do so because we're going to transition over there in just a couple minutes. Okay, so yeah, that's really interesting. I mean, it sounds like you've had a year where it's like, cool, the model works and it's great, and then you've had a year where it's like, hey, we're having some challenges, and you were able to kind of leverage that flexibility and the communication around it to make that work, so to speak. Um, what I guess like more generally, as we kind of transition, like what do you feel like you've learned about being an employee-owned organization, about transitioning, that you would kind of highlight for other folks who are thinking about this as a potential pathway?
Yeah, I will say, I think one of the things to really think about is your board and TSC structure.
Mm,
The EOT model provides a lot of flexibility around that. And I think one of the real challenges in our structure, we were a 30-person organization 2 years ago. We're at 25, 26 now. We have a 7-member board made up entirely of employees. Our TSC is 5-member, mostly
that's the
executives,
like
and our former
trust
owner.
trust board. Yeah.
So that's our board of directors and our
Yeah.
so like
Yeah. Yeah.
about half of our employees became involved in one way or another, and that's kind of out of balance.
Yeah.
They
It's a
meet
lot.
Um, and I think that the board is chartered much more, frankly, much more like a nonprofit board than a corporate board. And we understand that most EOTs are not being structured that way today. And I would be happy to talk to anybody. And as would my board, as would our board
Yeah.
chairs. I think be happy to talk to, like, we are re-examining our bylaws now to
Yeah.
sort of streamline that. It's just a lot to ask from a lot of people on top of their jobs.
Yeah.
And also, if you think about the size of our organization, is it reasonable to find that many people in the organization to know enough about the business for it to function smoothly when big decisions have to be made?
Right.
I said last year was challenging. We had to conduct a RIF mid-year. And it was the first time in RDA's history, 40 years. And this was really hard for our employee board to wrap their heads around. And we lacked the counsel we could expect if we had a more strategically seated board and maybe some outside
Can you
counsel.
clarify the acronym there, RIF?
Oh, sorry. Reduction in force. We had to lay off some people.
Okay. Got it.
Right?
Got it. Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah.
That's keep me honest on the acronyms because we live with a lot of them. So, I mean, I think if we'd had some external counsel and it wasn't just John and I think it would have been a
Yeah.
much easier conversation for folks about whether this was the right move. And
Right.
honestly, I probably would have, I mean, I would have benefited from that as well.
Yeah.
I think we
Yes.
all would have. So I think one thing to really think about in your board is how do you ensure that you have the active participation of folks who have more seat time
Yeah.
in some kind of executive role than the
Right.
average employee.
Yeah. That, like, external sort of third party perspective.
Yeah, and make sure, I mean, we all want to have a strategic board, right? We want a
Yeah.
board that helps us think beyond the day-to-day, that helps us innovate, that helps make introductions into key areas.
Yeah.
And I think there's no reason why an EOT should be deprived of that benefit.
Yeah, totally. Awesome. Great. Well, I appreciate you sharing so candidly about, all the like successes and challenges and stuff like that. I think that's really valuable. I'll start switching over to questions here. And if we hit a point, I've obviously got a million more questions, but I'll ask the first one. Maybe you've already answered this, but as a more seniored EOT, what is your biggest piece of advice to somebody thinking about going this path?
Okay, three things. The first one absolutely is to treat the business as the third entity in the deal. If you're really doing this because of legacy and sustainability, then make sure that you're thinking about the employees, the owner, and the business. I think from a financial standpoint, from a structural standpoint, and that's what's gonna tip you to things like the line of credit. I think the second piece is be flexible in your bylaws about what your expectation is for your board and trust stewardship committee, and really think about how you scale that over time. It may be a small group that meets infrequently at the beginning to manage that transition with an advisory group of employees, right? But there's so many ways to do it that are within the legal allowable limits of an EOT. Really think about what does it look like to have a strategic board that also honors the input of employee owners.
Yeah.
And then the third one is that I can't say enough about the decision matrix that our consultant had us go through and how much that has helped us really think through what are the critical roles in the organization and the critical decision points.
I love that. So be clear about who the stakeholders are and including the company as like a stakeholder as you plan the transaction and the financing. Be clear about roles and responsibilities as you transition, sort of operational. And then there was, maybe I missed the.
And then like really thinking about decisions and
Yeah.
responsibilities.
Yeah, cool. Awesome. Cool. So Jonathan asked, how much time was/has been planned for the employee buyout of the original owners?
7 years.
7 years. And how did you land on that as a structure?
You know, honestly, I think it was recommended
Hmm.
by our consulting team. It seemed reasonable to both parties. I don't
Yeah.
know that we tested 7 years in any like real way. Um, it, it seemed like, 5 years was going to put our debt a little too high. 10 years
Yeah.
felt like an unreasonably long time frame,
Right.
given where our owner was.
Right.
Um, you know, so it felt like a good number, and I still think that's a good number.
Nice. Yeah. You guys are 2 years in now, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Awesome. Okay, cool. I'll keep going. Dustin asked, what, if any, were the benefits of having an EOT in a tough year for the business?
Um, I think I talked about the governance challenges. Um, our particular structure um meant that we were doing a lot of mutual education
Hmm.
at a moment that had a tremendous sense of urgency.
Hmm.
And um, you know, again, year one, hitting everything, that felt really easy. Year two, I really, really wished we'd had some folks on our board who'd been through um had been through similar situations, had that legacy experience.
Right. Right. So it's more of a learning about like the EOT could have had an ancillary benefit in a tough year, provided some like structural stuff was
Right.
put in place. And so now you're kind of looking seriously at that structural, hey, what would we have liked to have in this tough year?
And again, it's not that we're an EOT.
Sure.
It's not that
Yeah.
we're employee owned trust. I
Yeah.
think it's really being thoughtful about we did the decision matrix thing,
Yeah.
and then we didn't necessarily do the next step, which is
Mm.
to map out who's making the decisions that each of those entities is responsible for. And how do
Right.
you make sure you have the right people around the table when those discussions come up?
Right. Right.
And
Got
that
it.
is really the next step.
Got
Um,
it.
and I mean, I think we're very much in agreement, the board and the TSC and the executive team on, we're going to make some changes to our bylaws. And I think,
Yeah.
we're going to get through this just fine. But, it, a little less friction never
Yeah.
hurts.
Yeah. And I think by way of answering that question, you've kind of answered another question, which is, if you could do it again, is there anything you do differently in the design and the process of the EOT? It sounds like really mapping out those decisions more clearly, as well as having a clearer role for external expertise.
Yeah.
Sounds like two things that are pretty obvious. Anything else that you would add to that?
Yep. I think that that's exactly right.
Cool.
And again, there's a lot of ways to do that,
Yeah. Yeah,
but
of course.
yeah,
Cool. We have another question, which is, how engaged are your employees? Have you experienced a lift in employees having ownership mentality since transitioning to an EOT?
I think that's such a great question. And I think it's the question that probably everyone asks. And I mean, I'll say honestly, yes and no. I think, at Common Trust sponsored a steward circle meeting in March of last year, and people came together. And one of the things I heard that I think has been really, really helpful, and I think it's the Zingerman's founders
Hmm.
have a 30-30-30 rule, which is that 30% are going to be super engaged, 30% are going to, that's fine, that's great. It's not the reason I came here or why I'm here. And
Yeah.
30% kind of don't care.
Yeah.
And the key thing is that for the people who don't care, just make sure that that's not sort of like a toxic element in your organization.
Right.
I will say that 30-30 rule, 30-30-30 rule changes based on the conversation all
Hmm.
the time. And that's
Right.
okay.
Different
So I
people
think
care
as
about
long as
different
you're not
things.
trying to get like 100%, streamers and balloons, I think you're going to be really good. We have to accept that not everyone cares about everything. We are accountable for measuring perceptions of access to decision making,
Hmm.
but we can't judge ourselves on getting 100% enthusiasm on every decision. I think
Sure.
there's some things we do. We have a variety of feedback mechanisms around organizational initiatives and investments, really big ticket items.
Yeah.
We found that because we work across time zones and that we have to acknowledge that we have different participation styles, but
Yeah.
also our workforce is super comfortable with technology. We use asynchronous feedback methods to gather feedback so that people have more access to participation on their own terms. So
Right.
we'll have like a board that we leave open for a couple of weeks that people come in and comment on and build a conversation around that, and then close with a conversation, but understand that, the people who are going to talk in a meeting may not be the same people who have a really good idea, but haven't learned yet that the rest of us would really value them voicing it.
Hmm.
Right. So I
Right.
think really thinking um, about creating avenues for employee owners to engage without, and measuring the success of those, again, I'll repeat,
Right.
but without holding ourselves accountable for 100% participation.
Right. So just having realistic expectations about who's going to engage and how much they're going to engage in, and then experimenting with like different ways of engaging with people.
Right.
Yeah. No, that makes a lot of sense. Um, we've just launched a poll for folks. We're headed towards the end here. So where we can, we like to end kind of 5 minutes early. So we'll do a couple more questions here. But if you guys do want to answer the question about this session and whether it was valuable, that'd be super helpful for us. Awesome. So just rounding this out in terms of um, questions, we have one, actually, we may have hit all of these. Heather asks, have you seen an impact of having every employee, even new employees, receiving profit share, either in terms of culture or motivation or like hiring trends, applicants, stuff like that? Like, what has been the impact of the profit sharing program in particular?
That's a great question. I think some of there's a great solid handful of applicants who are really excited that we're in EOT when they come to
Yeah.
us.
Yeah.
I think that even the smallest profit sharing has had a phenomenal impact on new employees' perception of the organization they've joined. I
Nice.
would not change that. I
Interesting.
think
Yeah, I feel like that's not a given. I feel like people don't necessarily feel like a small profit share will be meaningful for people, but
I'm
it
really
sounds like you're saying
surprised
something
that
different.
some of the most beautiful notes I've gotten from employees are people who are like, I really didn't expect I'd be included this, and this really confirms that I've made the right decision.
Hmm.
You
Cool.
know, I think it's totally worth it.
Got it.
Because again, we're not talking about a full share. We're talking about, something that acknowledges that they have joined our team and that they're part of our team. And that makes a promise for the future.
Yeah. Yeah. I love that. Awesome. Well, as we head towards kind of ending here, any like last comments or suggestions that you would make for folks as like a takeaway in terms of thinking about, for business owner thinking about this, for management teams whose business owners are thinking about this? Love to just give you an opportunity to riff on any of that.
Sure. I will say that the two best things I've done outside of being part of RDA
Yeah.
have been attending your Steward Circle meeting and the NCEO August Forum, which is where they have their EOT track. And Lauren has
Nice.
told me that they're going to do that in the future. Come and talk to people, ask a
Hmm.
lot of questions. That's not something we had the benefit of doing. And I will say that when I got to Steward Circle, I was really surprised at the
And just as a
variety.
clarification, Amalia is talking about Steward Circle, which is a yearly conference that we put on for employee ownership trust folks and folks who are thinking about becoming employee owned to come together and just meet other owners who've done this. Sorry, just wanted
That's
to
okay.
clarify.
And the National Center for Employee Ownership has added an EO track to their fall conference. And
Yeah.
I think those are two tremendous opportunities to talk to people. Next year, I mean, or I guess it's now this year, I'd really like to bring a board member.
Yeah.
It's been
That's a cool
mostly
idea.
CEOs and owners.
Yeah.
But I think given what we're asking of board members, especially employee or board members, that makes a lot of sense. But I think really like spend a minute and immerse yourself in the options. You don't have to have a binder, but I think you have to have a lot of ideas percolating.
Yeah.
Depending on who you are, you might have a binder, but I really, and I think, anyone on this call who wants to follow up and ask questions of me, I'm absolutely open. I've benefited hugely from other, especially owners who talked about how they thought about the transition,
Yeah.
um, and what they wanted for it, because it kind of helps keep me honest to protecting the legacy that that I've been invested with.
Yeah. Awesome. We really appreciate your time. We'll end a few minutes early here because I know that everybody is like in the Zoom universe of back-to-backs and whatnot. One last request for folks, if you're on the call, to fill out that feedback form just to help us get feedback about whether these sessions are valuable for people. And then I've just dropped in the chat a link if any of you want to chat with us, talk more about this as an option for your business. You know, feel free to click that link and book a free advisory call with us. And yeah, I'll just say, once again, thank you so much, Amalia, for joining us. We really appreciate you taking the time. Know that you're both like busy running a company and also getting over a little bit of sickness. So just appreciate you showing up and sharing your wisdom with everybody here. I think it's been super valuable and we definitely appreciate it.
Yeah, really happy to be here.
Cool. All right. Thanks, everybody.